Multiple Schedules of Reinforcement to Produce Differential Responding in a Human Subject by Rachel Mayer. Various studies have been conducted using multiple schedules of reinforcement. Many of these studies have been completed using animals, specifically pigeons. In 1960, Reynolds conducted a study to determine the effects that different schedules of reinforcement could have on the responding of pigeons. He would study various sequences of the schedules to determine how each set of schedules affected the responses of the pigeon. Another study conducted by Schwartz, Hamilton, and Silberberg in 1975 looked at the behavioral contrast in a pigeon, particularly the duration of key pecking maintained on a multiple schedules of reinforcement. Data was collected on the duration of pecks on each of the two keys that were present during the experiment. The experimenters concluded that the duration of the pecks on the signal key was shorter than the duration of pecks on the operand key. In 1974, Nevin used pigeons in an experiment utilizing multiple schedules of reinforcement. He used two VI schedules paired with different colored lights and keys. The purpose of this experiment was to compare the response strength in multiple schedules of reinforcement. He concluded that behaviors maintained by the VI1 schedule were stronger than the behaviors maintained by the VI3 schedule. Nevin quoted Kling from 1971 as having stated, "The term response strength refers to the speed, intensity, or persistence with which responses occur." Nevin was comparing response strengths emitted by the pigeons, and the current study is looking to determine the response strength, specifically the speed of the subject's responses emitted during the different schedules of reinforcement. The current study was conducted to observe the response strength of the subject's responses on his math work. His completion of math problems was reinforced on FI2 and FR5 schedules of reinforcement. The purpose of the multiple schedules was to increase the speed at which the subject completed the math problems. The subject of the study was a male high school student aged 17 years. He has a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. The subject is not medicated for the diagnosis of ADHD. The subject is enrolled at the local high school, and permission was received from the parents and subjects before the experiment was started. All sessions of the experiment were conducted in the home of the subject. The subject, experimenter, and parent were all present for all sessions. Each session was conducted at a table in the kitchen to keep the setting consistent in each trial. The materials used for this experiment were an iPhone for a stopwatch and recording device, math worksheets, a pencil, and a food reinforcer. A calculator was available if the subject needed it, but it was not mandatory to use. A computer program was used to determine the order of schedules of reinforcement before each trial began. A piece of paper with a symbol representing the FR5 schedule and a piece of paper with a symbol representing the FI2 schedule were also used. The experiment began by collecting baseline data. The subject was given a worksheet with math problems on it. The problems were within the subject's ability range based on previous testing results received from the subject's mother. Testing results were obtained to ensure that the problems given in this experiment were not too difficult. The baseline trials consisted of two 10-minute sessions where the subject was observed completing as many math problems correctly as he could during that time period. The number of problems completed correctly was recorded. After the two baseline sessions were completed, the training trials were conducted. The training trials consisted of the addition of two different stimuli to signify which schedule of reinforcement was in place. Each training session lasted 10 minutes. The order of the implementation of schedules was determined before each training session began. The FR5 schedule was number 1 and the FI2 schedule was number 2. A website was used to randomly generate the order of which the schedules would be implemented. The experimenter had a sheet of paper with the order on it so they could transition through the schedules when appropriate. At the beginning of the trial, the experimenter displayed either the symbol signifying the FR5 schedule was in place or the symbol signifying the FI2 schedule was in place. The subject was then told to complete as many math problems correctly as they could in 10 minutes. The subject was then reinforced after the 5th problem completed correctly if the FR5 schedule was in place, or reinforced after the first correct problem completed after 2 minutes if the FI2 schedule was in place. This continued and the schedules were alternated for 10 minutes. Data was collected after each schedule was finished within that training trial. The training trials were conducted until the experimenter noted differential responding. After the experimenter observed the subject responding differently depending on which schedule was currently in place, the training trial stopped and the experimental trials began. The subject was given the problems under each schedule and data was again collected. The results show that after the training trials, the subject responded differently when different stimuli were presented within a multiple schedule of reinforcement. During the training trials, the subject responded with similar response strength, specifically the speed of response, regardless of which stimulus was presented. After the 4th training trial, the subject was observed to respond differently based on which stimulus was present. After the 4th training trial was completed, the experimental trials began. During the experimental trials, a difference in responding was observed. During the FR5 schedules, the subject was observed to complete the problems quickly to receive the food reinforcement. During the FI2 schedule, the subject performed noticeably slower, as observed by the number of problems correctly completed versus the number of problems correctly completed during the FR5 schedule. During FI2 schedules, the subject was observed to take more sips of pop or water, use the calculator more often, pick at the paper or pencil more often than when the FR5 schedule was in place. Towards the end of the 2 minutes, the subject would complete a problem to receive the reinforcement. The performance under the FR5 schedule was much more consistent compared to the performance on the FI2 schedule. See the next slide for a graph of the results. This graph represents the number of responses emitted on each schedule of reinforcement. The triangle represents baseline or no reinforcement, the square represents the FR5 schedule, and the circle represents the FI2 schedule. Based on the results of the study, different schedules of reinforcement produced different responses. In this study, behaviors reinforced on an FR2 schedule were consistent and reliable, while behaviors reinforced on the FI schedule were more varying and unpredictable. During the FR schedule, the subject completed the given problems in a similar time each time the schedule was in place. During the FI schedule, the subject would complete 1 or 2 problems and then response strength would decrease until the end of the 2 minutes. An implication of the study is that different schedules of reinforcement can result in differential responding in a subject. When a multiple schedule of reinforcement is in place and 2 different simple schedules of reinforcement are being alternated, the responses observed in the presence of an initially arbitrary stimuli would be different. Initially, the symbols shown were nonsense to the subject. By the end of the experiment, the subject demonstrated understanding of the symbols by giving different responses based on which symbol was presented. A limitation of the study was the food reinforcement used. If the subject began the trial and was already satiated, they may have been less motivated to complete the problems to receive a food reinforcement. Another limitation of the study may have been the length of the training trials. 10 minutes may have been too long for the trials based on the amount of work to be completed during a 10-minute trial. Future research could build upon the findings of this study. Future research could continue to use human subjects to demonstrate differential responding on multiple schedules of reinforcement. Many studies have used animals, especially pigeons, to test multiple schedules of reinforcement. Using humans with this complex schedule of reinforcement may provide data that can be useful.